Konnichiwa, everyone. I am back. It has been way too long. Oh my God, let's never do that again. Did you miss me? Did you panic? Did you not know how to make sense of current events? Well, I'm back and I've been looking forward to this. I think actually, I do these videos and I tweet thoughts and share different sorts of sense making mechanisms. But I actually think that doing these live streams might be my favorite thing that I do as an influencer. So thanks for joining me live. And even if you're not watching live and you're watching the recording, I appreciate you too. I'm Kaizen, in case you forgot. This is Nuanced Live. Every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we break down some of the week's top headlines. And today, we're going to have a special focus and a deep dive on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which I don't believe I've ever actually spoken at length about. I generally tend to focus more on events that are A, just of interest to me, and B, are more America-centric and centered on here, what's going on domestically in the homeland. But Russia-Ukraine is important because, well, for one thing, the U.S. has spent $183 billion on the conflict. And there have been some updates this week that have inched us closer toward peace. I hope, fingers crossed. And I thought it's just a good opportunity to talk about it. In addition to that, I'm going to give you a little bit of a recap of some of my experience in Japan. Now, this is not going to be a whole live blog about everything that I did in Japan and all the yummy foods that I ate. And they were yummy. Let me tell you, Japanese food, cuisine, amazing. But actually, some of my political encounters unexpectedly was not looking for them at all in Japan. So at the end of the stream, I'll talk about that. But for now, let's talk about Russia-Ukraine. And my intention in talking about this is not to get into some moral philosophical debate about whether Ukraine is more in the wrong or Russia is more in the wrong and who should be getting what land or any of that. Because as I mentioned before, I'm looking at things from an American-centric perspective. So I want to be humble about the limits of my perspective because I just don't understand Russian or Ukrainian culture. I don't understand a lot of the history. That said, I want to do some simple, high-level sense-making around the chronology of the conflict, provide you one of the strongest steelman pro-Russian cases, one of the strongest steelman pro-Ukraine cases, talk about this new deal that was just signed this week, which essentially was a deal that made the U.S. a shareholder and investor in Ukrainian rare earth minerals. So I'll talk about why that matters later. And I'm going to give you some thoughts on where we need to go from here in order to get what I believe should be the goal for everyone, which is peace, and for this 3-year-long war to stop so people stop dying. So before I go, last time, or maybe it was the time before that, we had issues with the audio. So before we jump into this and I just start talking for 30 minutes and realize you guys can't hear me, can you guys hear me? Please just type in the chat if you can hear me. I want to verify that before I start spitting. So can you hear me? Someone, anyone? I know you're probably all hiding in your bathroom stall at work during the day, listening to me. Okay, perfect. Someone just verified. Ned, thank you. Thomas, thank you. Lori, thank you. All right, thanks. Let's get into this. So first, here's a timeline of neutral facts. And when I say the word neutral, I'm saying that I'm striving for neutrality. I'm a human. We all have unconscious biases, but I triple check this timeline so that at least I know that the facts are facts and that the timeline is accurate. Maybe some of my description might seem a little bit imperfect, but I'm striving for neutrality before I get into the pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian arguments. So here's where we start. Let's start in the year 1990. And the reason why 1990 is important is because at that time, the Secretary of State, James Baker, told Mikhail Gorbachev, who headed up the Soviet Union at that time, that NATO, which is, of course, the North American Trade Organization, which is essentially a military defense pact between US and European nations. The Secretary of State back then told the head of the USSR that NATO will not expand, quote, 1 inch eastward beyond the unified Germany at the time. Here's the thing. That was not formalized in writing. However, it has been verified by multiple sources that this was said, and you can consider it more of a political agreement that was verbal but never codified or actually signed. But that's what the US essentially told Russia. So then in 1994, remember, the USSR had just collapsed and there were a lot of nukes around. So the Ukraine, which had been part of the USSR, had one of the biggest nuclear arsenals in the world. It was actually the third largest arsenal in the world. And at the time, the Western nations and Russia and Ukraine were thinking, well, what do we do with this? Because we just went through the Cold War. We want to minimize the number of nukes in the world, and we got to figure out what we do with this massive nuclear arsenal that's in Ukraine. So the Budapest Memorandum was an agreement between the Ukraine, the US, Russia, and other European nations that in exchange for guarantees of sovereignty from Russia, the US, and the UK, the Ukraine would give up its nuclear arsenal. So basically they said, hey, we're not going to use these nukes, but you guys need to respect our sovereignty. And to be absolutely clear, because the devil is in the details here, the Budapest Memorandum did not obligate any party to step in the defense of Ukraine if another party were to violate Ukraine's sovereignty. So for example, imagine that the US had invaded Ukraine for some reason. They would have, or we in that case, would have violated the Budapest Memorandum, which was an agreement that was actually signed. But Russia, who also signed the Budapest Memorandum, would not be obligated to step in our defense. The Budapest Memorandum operates differently from NATO. By contrast, if, let's say, Russia invaded Poland, who is in NATO, the US would be obligated to step in Poland's defense because that's part of what the NATO treaty allows for. So the Budapest Memorandum is basically an agreement that was formal, but the part of the problem is that there's no actual enforcement mechanism. So if someone did decide to violate Ukraine's sovereignty, which Russia objectively did do, they did objectively violate the Budapest Memorandum, even if you believe that it was justified, it doesn't require that the US step in against Russia. Then 1999. So you'll remember 9 years prior to that, in 1990, the Secretary of State of the United States said that NATO is not going to expand 1 inch eastward. Well, that ended up being not true because in 1999, there was the first NATO expansion eastward to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. So Russia, from their perspective, this word from the Secretary of State of the United States was violated. 2004, NATO expands further, this time up to Russia's border. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which all are former parts of a Soviet republic, all joined. And that brought NATO directly to Russia's doorstep. And we'll talk about the pro-Russian steelman case of why they feel threatened by this in a moment. But that's just factually what happened. Nations on Russia's border were NATO member nations by 2004. Then in 2008, there was the Russia-Georgia war. Now, depending on how old you are, you might remember this. You might remember this being not a huge deal. It certainly wasn't as big of a deal as the Ukraine-Russia war, but it was a significant geopolitical event. So here it actually echoes in some part what's going on more recently with Ukraine, because Georgia wanted to move toward being part of NATO, and there were signals that they were wanting to do that. And then in addition to that, there were more local disputes between Russia and Georgia, partially due to those local disputes and partially due to Georgia wanting to join NATO. Russia invaded and occupied parts of Georgia. And many people interpreted that as a warning shot to NATO and Ukraine to not continue to expand NATO closer to Russia's border. Then in 2008, George W. Bush, remember that guy? He pushed for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. So he publicly pushed for this. And NATO declared that they will become members. They didn't set any particular timeline. Russia didn't really like that, and they strongly objected to that. Now, fast forward to 2014. This is a local dispute with international import. In 2014, there was actually a revolution in the Ukraine called the Maidan Revolution. And during that revolution, the democratically elected president, Yanukovych, he fled after months of protest. And those protests were backed by the US. The degree to which the US was involved is unclear, but there are documented calls on record of the US at least being sympathetic to the regime change in the UK. And it looks like the CIA was actually directly involved. Now, this is not to say that the revolution would not have happened without US involvement. It was what appears to be a grassroots revolution, but it was at minimum ideologically aligned with the US and very likely directly supported by the US subversively. And for reference to this, you can look up Victoria Nuland's call. There's actually a documented call where Victoria Nuland, who was involved in the government at that time, talks about US being supportive of the Maidan Revolution in 2014. So then, shortly thereafter, Russia annexes Crimea. So you guys remember that? Russian troops seized Crimea, and there was a referendum that the international community did not recognize, but Russia was touting as some justification for their annexation of Crimea that indicated that there was overwhelming support among Crimeans for joining Russia. So whether the referendum itself was an actually accurate poll, that's a different question. But what we do know is that there was a referendum that technically indicated that this was the case. It's just unclear whether the referendum was legitimate. The international community rejected it, and they claimed that it was done under duress and coercion by Russia. So now we look at a more modern period from 2014 to 2022. So even before the invasion, there was conflict between Russia and Ukraine in the Donbass region. So if you've been following this more closely, you've probably heard about the Donbass region. The Donbass region is important because that's where there's been fighting between the Ukrainian government and Russian-backed separatists who are technically part of Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, but are more supportive of Russia and want to be a part of Russia. So from Russia's perspective, the Ukrainian government was killing ethnic Russians who wanted Ukraine, or at least the Donbass region, to be a part of Russia. And from a Ukrainian perspective, this was a separatist revolution and not indication that the Donbass region believes that they should be a part of Russia. Then, or around this time, Biden, he affirmed his support for NATO membership for Ukraine in public statements. And in a joint US-Ukraine statement, he reiterated his support for Ukraine's aspiration to join NATO. But again, there was no specific timeline. Then, of course, in February 2022, Russia launched their invasion of Ukraine. Putin cited NATO expansion and alleged threats to Russian speakers in the Donbass region as justification for the invasion. Now, there may be, and I'm sure there actually are, other reasons involved as well. I don't know what's going on in Putin's head, but these are the things that he actually cited as his explicit reasons for wanting to invade. And those are some of the just more chronological, neutral, historical facts about what's been happening. Last thing you should know is that before he left office in 2023, well, 2023 was like 2 years ago now. It's crazy. Biden said that Ukraine's future is in NATO. So this is after Russia had already invaded, and Biden made another strong verbal commitment, but Ukraine was still not granted membership or a timetable for this actually happening. Okay, that was a mouthful. You guys get it so far? Are there any questions? I'm actually going to check it in the chat. Are there any questions? Oh, thank you. Mr. Right now corrected me. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, not Trade Organization. Thank you. I misspoke there. Okay, cool. No questions. Let's keep on going. Now, there's a, I don't know if you would call it a logical fallacy or an argumentative device called straw manning that you've probably heard of. And straw manning is essentially when you characterize the opposition's argument by using the weakest form of their arguments and addressing that. And you see this all the time online. Instead of people engaging with what people are actually saying, they'll make up a really weak version of the argument, and then they'll attack that. And then, of course, they look smart by comparison, but they didn't actually win the argument because they didn't engage with a strong version of the argument. So we're going to do the opposite of that. We're going to do what's called steel manning the arguments for Ukraine and for Russia. And steel manning is just what it sounds like. it's taking the strongest version of the argument that at least I can muster in this moment and presenting that to you. So here's a steel man of the pro-Ukraine perspective. Oh, give me a second here. Oh. All right, so I must reveal to you. I know you guys are like, wow, how does he remember all these facts? I don't. I use a teleprompter for the super deep dive technical stuff, and my teleprompter just broke. So give me a second here. We're going to fix this. Still a grassroots organization here. So you can say you were here before I blew up. I guess I kind of already blown up, but before I blew up, when it was just me and you on a Friday talking about politics. Who does that? Guess we do. Okay, so here's the pro-Ukraine perspective. From the Ukrainian perspective, their sovereignty was violated, and there was a political signed agreement between Ukraine, Russia, US, and other parties in the form of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. And according to that memorandum, Russia explicitly agreed to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. And it wasn't even that Russia broke this agreement in 2022. They already broke it in 2014 by annexing Crimea, and then they did it again with this invasion in 2022. So from a Ukrainian perspective, it's like, what the heck? We gave up our nuclear arsenal, and the exchange was that we're not going to get invaded if we do that, and now we're getting invaded. So why did we give up our nuclear arsenal? We might as well have kept it, because now we're not keeping our sovereignty. Pro-Ukraine argument will also be that this desire to join NATO was legitimate because they wanted Western integration, because they would claim that a majority of Ukrainians, especially in West and Center Ukraine, have been in favor of joining the EU and NATO, not just for security reasons and having to do with Russia, but also economic reasons. Because as you heard my misspeaking before, NATO is a treaty organization, but it also there's a lot of trade within NATO NATO countries, and there's a lot of ideological alignment. And then, of course, there's overlap between NATO nations and EU nations. And this would be viewed as a sovereign choice by the Ukrainian people. The pro-Ukraine camp would also argue that Russian aggression is not justified by NATO expansion. They would say that NATO is a defensive alliance, and Ukraine wanting to be a part of NATO is actually a response to Russian perceived threats, not the cause of the threats. So whereas Putin is saying, well, we had to invade because NATO was on our border, Ukraine would argue, well, yeah, we had to join NATO because you guys have been constantly threatening us this whole time. And many other EU nations agree with them, and that's why they wanted to join NATO over this time as well. Also, if we talk about the Maidan Revolution in 2014, yes, one could argue that it was supported logistically by the West and by the US, but ultimately it was a domestic, homegrown, grassroots revolution that was spawned by Ukrainian anger at Yanukovych's decision to pivot toward Russia and away from the EU. And many Ukrainians viewed Yanukovych as a pro-Russian agent, essentially, and they wanted to depose him and install a government that they considered more friendly to Ukrainian interests. They would also argue that the Donbass and Crimean narratives that Putin is spinning are overstated. And they would say that, yes, there are ethnic Russian-speaking populations in those regions, but many of those people in those regions don't want war, and the separatist movement was a part of the Donbass representation. It's not the whole, and it was inflamed by Russian interference. And they would say that actually Russia was inflaming tensions in the Donbass region rather than this being some sort of grassroots movement by part of Ukraine to want to be a part of Russia. So again, we're just talking about the Ukrainian perspective. I'm not saying that this is my perspective. And then there's the bigger case that people even outside of Ukraine have made, that this is just a violation of international law. Annexing territory by force sets a dangerous precedent. And, you know, if Russia gets to just redraw borders unilaterally, why can't China or Iran or other nations just do this unilaterally? And that's the crux of the more pan-Western, more, some people would say globalist view, that this Russian aggression needs to be resisted no matter what. So that's the line that a lot of EU and the Biden administration was espousing for those reasons. Okay, let's pause there. Any questions about the pro-Ukraine perspective? Again, that's a steelman of the pro-Ukraine perspective. I'm sure there's all sorts of additional details that we could weave in, but I want to keep this detailed enough that you have actually something you can grasp onto, while high level and general enough that you don't get bogged down in a bunch of details that are ultimately probably not that important to you as an American who is watching my stream right now. Okay, great. We're told that it makes sense. And Rita says that the teleprompter is a small concession for all the wonderful information you share with us, Kaizen. Thank you, Rita. Yeah, I usually like to just speak extemporaneously, and I weave in between teleprompter and not. But when it comes to super factual things, I really want to make sure I get my facts as straight as possible. So I appreciate that you are understanding. Okay, here's a steelman of the pro-Russian perspective now. So imagine you're Putin, and imagine you're the Russian people, even, right? Because Putin's actions, Putin's actually quite popular in Russia, as I understand it. So, from a Russian perspective, in 1990, the US Secretary of State promised that NATO would not expand eastward. And this was a broken promise. It might have just been a verbal promise, but it still was a promise. And since then, NATO has added 14 countries, including some countries that are directly on Russia's border. Now, why does this matter? Like, why, even if it's a defensive alliance, why does this matter to Russia? By way of analogy, I want you to imagine this. I'm not actually old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis from direct memory, but I've read up on it and watched movies on it and stuff like that. And just to give the high level details, there was a point at which Cuba, which is within striking distance of the United States, was effectively a Soviet satellite, and there were Soviet missiles there. And one could argue, oh, well, the Soviets just put it there defensively and they weren't going to use it offensively. But of course, from a US perspective, if we see that there's missiles in a neighboring country like Cuba, or imagine it's Mexico or Canada, we, of course, would be on edge and take issue with that as well. And this is on top of the fact that there were explicit assurances made that this would not happen. And it happened over the course of the last 3 decades. So that's part of Russia's concern. It's a security concern. On top of that security concern was what the Russians view as Western and US specific meddling in the affairs of Ukraine and the ousting of a democratically elected president in Yanukovych in favor of a at least less Russian aligned, and one could even say anti-Russian government in Ukraine. So from a Russian perspective, it's like this was a US engineered regime change. And again, you can go listen to Victoria Nuland's call talking about the US perspective on this. And from the Russian perspective, it's like, hey, you guys are telling us, A, that you're not going to expand NATO, and then you expand NATO. You are telling us that we shouldn't be violating the sovereignty of Ukraine while you're interfering with local Ukrainian governance. So that's part of the Putin argument from a security standpoint. He would also argue that Crimea has deep Russian roots. Crimea was a part of Russia until 1954. It housed a naval base for them. And in 2014, again, the nature of this referendum is disputed, but in 2014, there was a referendum that was held that showed the majority of people in Crimea wanting to be a part of Russia. So from Putin's perspective, this used to be a part of Russia. The people in there wanted to be a part of Russia. They are honoring the will of the people in Crimea, and it's to maybe a lesser extent, the people in the Donbass region too. He'd also argue that the Russian-speaking populations are actually under threat in Ukraine. So since the Maidan revolution, there have been things that the Ukrainian government has done to lessen Russian influence, both culturally and politically in Ukraine. And of course, they have their arguments for why they want to do it, because they view Russia as a threat and an aggressor. But it's things like banning Russian media, banning what they viewed as a pro-Russian political party, even though it was a relatively popular political party in their parliament. And from Putin's perspective and the Russians' perspective, this is marginalizing ethnic Russians who are still in Ukraine. And they view the military crackdown on the Russian separatists in the Donbass region, which is, again, in East Ukraine, as indiscriminate, harmful. They'd argue that civilians died, and that is true. There was basically you can think of this as an 8-year war that was going on, and civilians did die in addition to militarized separatists. So on top of all that, from a Russian perspective, if you actually look at a map, and I don't have the ability to pull up a map easily for you guys right now, but if you go look at a map, you just even do a Google image search, you can see that Ukraine is particularly powerfully situated from a geographic standpoint because of its orientation toward the Black Sea, in addition to the fact that it's actually within striking distance of Moscow. And that's actually come into play because there actually have been strikes on Moscow from Ukraine during this conflict. So Russia didn't want Ukraine to join NATO because they wanted them to either be a neutral or a friendly state because, again, if NATO absorbs Ukraine, then missiles can be mounted there and then within striking distance of Moscow, and it's an existential threat. And this isn't paranoia, as has been borne out. It is strategic logic there. And you might disagree with whether that logic justifies an invasion. I think there's a reasonable discussion to be had there, but that is a strategic concern that they've had. And then the more general concern the more general criticism of the US involvement in Ukraine is that the US keeps on preaching that Ukraine should be sovereign and that Russia shouldn't be meddling in the affairs of other nations. But Russians would point out what we've done in Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan and lots of nations around the world. And they would argue that we've repeatedly violated sovereignty when it suited our interests. So Russia sees its action in Ukraine as no worse than what the US has been doing globally for decades. So that's an overview of the timeline of events, as neutrally stated as I could muster, the best pro-Ukrainian argument I can muster, and the best pro-Russian argument that I can muster. Before we move on and talk about the deal that just happened this week, I'm just curious, post in the chat, which argument are you more sympathetic to? The pro-Ukraine argument or pro-Russian argument? And this doesn't mean that you believe that, Ukraine should totally give things over to Russia or vice versa. I'm just curious, from my recap of the arguments so far, which one are you more sympathetic to, even if you don't believe that the US should be involved, which I know many Americans feel that way. Interesting. Okay, we got some interesting pro-Russia in the chat so far. Yeah, it's actually interesting to think about this because I think I'm speculating here, but my observation is a lot of the political left in this country is very firmly pro-Ukraine, and it's almost like a moral argument that they're making. I mean, there's a clip of Kamala saying, "Let me make this simple. Ukraine is a small nation and Russia is a big nation," which is, I mean, I guess it's technically true. I don't consider that very sophisticated logic for why we need to be involved, but I think for a lot of people, it's as simple as they view Russia as fundamentally ideologically misaligned with the West and Western values. They view the Ukraine as more aligned. They view Russia and Putin as a bully, as a tyrant, as a dictator who wants to restore the Soviet Union, and views the fight between Ukraine and Russia as actually a fight between Western democracy and Russian totalitarianism. Whereas a lot of people on the right, I don't think are as ideologically committed, but I have noticed a trend of more people being more sympathetic to Russia. If I were to speculate, I think part of the reason is because they view this by analogy as similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they're sympathetic to the argument that, hey, the US wouldn't want missiles on our border either. And I think that there's many people on the political right who just don't want to be involved at all, and are tired of the narrative that's been pushed by the political left and the amount of money that's gone into this war. So I guess I'm not totally surprised, but it's still interesting. And I don't think it became even, honestly, it wasn't even that safe to say, yeah, I kind of think the Russians have a point until relatively recently. I mean, that's something that would definitely get you canceled because remember, I mean, way back in 2016, Trump was getting accused of being a Russian agent. And it's pretty ironic in hindsight, considering people complaining about Trump saying that the election was stolen. Hillary Clinton was claiming that the election was essentially stolen by the Russians and Russian interference. So yes, it's become very faux pas until recently to even be, I wouldn't even say sympathetic to a Russian perspective, just to even state what the Russian perspective even is. And yeah, Candy just said I can sympathize both ways. Yeah, I can sympathize both ways. And the point of me giving you this perspective is not to skew you in either direction, but rather, and I am going to state my perspective just to be clear, but rather just so you understand the both perspectives. Because look, my philosophy on this is current events and political issues come and go. Like the what's that we're talking about on a particular day or week is constantly changing. The how we talk about these things is what's actually fundamental and persistent and where the real work needs to be done. Because if we're constantly having one-sided arguments where people are just on their moral high horses, refusing to get off, and they don't even understand the argument of the opposition, whether this is Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Palestine, right, left, Democrat, Republican, we're not going to get anywhere. So we actually need to make sure that we understand not just a part of the opposition's argument, but the actual best case argument. Because, and now here's where we talk about US interests. The US is involved, and we don't technically have a legal treaty obligated dog in the fight. We just don't. Again, yes, the US did sign the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, and that obligates the US to not intervene with Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. It does not obligate the US to defend Ukraine against Russia. I want to make that super clear. And that is, of course, why Ukraine was pushing to be a part of NATO, because they wanted that guarantee from the US, but the US, for various reasons, was not willing to give that to them. So the US has been in this weird position where, for certainly the latter part of the 20th century, much of the early 21st century up to this point, the US has been at least ideologically aligned with Ukraine to the extent that it's in opposition to Russia. And coming out of the Cold War, I mean, Russia was the great evil, and Russia was in the space race, and they're our biggest rival, and it was all US versus Russia. Now, we've had one and a half, maybe 2 generations since then. And I think it's worth revisiting that thesis of, hey, is Russia this mortal enemy? They don't necessarily need to be our ally, but they don't need to be the mortal enemy that they were during the Cold War. But a lot of the prevailing logic in Washington, as far as I can see, is that no, Russia's bad. We are not allies with Russia. So the enemy of our enemy is our friend. Ukraine is our friend. We need to stand for Ukraine, for Western values. But again, there's been no formal commitment. And while there's been no formal commitment, the US has given $183 billion of American taxpayer money to a war where hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians are dying with no discernible end in sight. So what are we doing? There hasn't been a clear strategy here. What I've seen from Biden and EU leaders is a lot of moral grandstanding about Western values and democracy. And frankly, I consider a lot of this pretty hollow, considering the things that the US has been doing in the Middle East and Libya and many other places across the world. But irrespective of that, like, even if there is a moral imperative for the US to be involved in the US or the Ukrainian-Russia conflict and to give money to Ukraine, okay, what's the actual strategy? Is it that we just keep on giving money to Ukraine, which is a much smaller nation, which has no nukes, versus Russia, which is a much bigger nation and has the largest nuclear stockpile in the world? What amount of money is going to allow Ukraine to win this war versus Russia? Or is the subtext here that we're going to defend them no matter what, even if it means deploying battalions of US soldiers to Ukraine? And we have sent some troops to Ukraine, just so you know. There are US soldiers who have been fighting on the behalf of Ukraine against Russia. That's happening right now. So I've heard a lot of moralizing. I haven't heard a lot of strategizing around that. And as an American taxpayer, I don't like that, because I don't see why this money, I could see the logic. I don't agree with the logic, frankly, that Russia's going to invade Ukraine and then Russia's going to invade Poland and then America is next, which is what Zelensky said in that now notorious and infamous press conference where he had the blow up with JD Vance and Trump. His logic was that, hey, if Putin is allowed to take Ukraine, you guys are next. I just don't buy that logic. I don't. First of all, if Putin then invades Poland, then NATO gets triggered, and then we actually have beef, and then we can actually do a real muscular military response. But frankly, even past that, it's not all that apparent that Putin's ambitions are to take over the world. which is what we've been fed a narrative about for a long time. And again, I think that thesis needs to be revised and updated and looked at from a more sober perspective. And I am not saying that Putin is justified in invading Ukraine. I am saying that the American government's first priority is to take care of America first and to use Americans' money on Americans first. So if we're going to send money to any country, I don't have any qualms with Ukraine. I don't have any dog in the fight. I care about humans more generally, but the difference between Ukraine versus Libya versus Nigeria, there's not a big difference to me. None of those are my homeland. None of those are my country. So there needs to be a very clear logic for why we're sending money to another country. And if the logic is that, well, if that country doesn't stand up, then our country is going to be threatened next, it just doesn't check out for me. Now, on top of that, even if we agree that we should be sending money, the question is, well, what is the best case outcome? Because for years, Biden and other EU leaders even refused to talk to Putin. No contact, no direct contact between Biden and Putin. And there's all this moral grandstanding. It's kind of the same, we don't negotiate with terrorist logic. But where does that get you? Because even if Putin is this great evil that we're being told that he is, he's still a guy who has power. And if you don't talk to the bully in the schoolyard, you're not going to make peace with the bully. If you're just backing the bully's enemies, you're certainly not going to win that bully over to your side if they are a threat to you eventually. So what was the end game here? And I think it's easy to preach about what sounds good rather than do what is good. And I think what is good is peace. It is not prosecuting an endless proxy war through Ukraine for something as vague as Western democracy. And by the way, I mean, Ukraine is notoriously one of the most corrupt countries in Eastern Europe and Europe more generally. So saying that this is some grand defense of democracy when, again, we helped overthrow a democratically elected president in Ukraine in 2014, this rings very hollow to me. So now, if we bring things to the present day, one of Trump's big policy promises, and one of the reasons I voted for him, is he wants to end these pointless wars. And we have to look at, well, what are the mechanisms for ending this war? And we have to be smart here, right? Because the war is not just going to end because we keep on telling Putin he's a bad man and wagging our finger and sending more money than, frankly, we can afford to spend and less money than Ukraine would even need. That's not going to work. And if it is going to work, it's going to work through attrition, and it's going to take a long time and hundreds of thousands more people dead, maybe even millions of people dead by the end of this. So one thing that Trump says a lot is peace through strength. What does that actually mean? Well, to bring back to the schoolyard analogy, if you have a bully in the schoolyard, if any of you have ever dealt with a bully, the way that you need to deal with a bully is through strength. Now, you don't need to be aggressive toward the bully, but you need to be someone that the bully wouldn't want to pick on. You need to be someone that the bully would look at and say, yeah, you know what? Not that guy. That guy, he's been taking Taekwondo lessons and been hitting the gym. I'm going to find someone else, right? So this is assuming that Putin is a bully. Let's just take this frame for a second. That said, the Ukraine is not essential to U.S. security or economic interests. So in order to defend the Ukraine or even provide some of our muscle in support of Ukraine, there needs to be a formal tying of interests. And that's what this new mineral deal does. The mineral deal that was signed this week makes the U.S. a shareholder and investor in the Ukrainian rare earth mineral deposits that they have over there. And not to bore you with the details, but rare earth minerals are used in things like military technology, drones, AI, semiconductors, many of the things that are increasingly becoming important in the 21st century, especially in warfare. So the US, by becoming an investor in that, gets the opportunity to recoup some of the $183 billion that we've given to Ukraine. And also, and I think this is not being really reported on or opined on as much as it should, it also subtly aligns the US with Ukraine and doesn't leave them out to dry. It says, look, maybe we are more aligned with Ukraine, or at minimum, we don't want to just pull the rug out from under them because, look, at the end of the day, they did get invaded by Russia. We have been supporting them, and it would kind of suck to just pull out abruptly with no recourse for Ukraine. So now, instead of the US saying, hey, we're going to provide security guarantees, which is binding and puts us in a position where if Putin escalates, then we need to escalate. And when two nuclear powers are escalating, all of a sudden things could get really hectic really fast. It's saying, hey, Putin, now if you continue to be aggressive toward Ukraine has indicated that they're willing to work with US, and also you're encroaching on our economic interests because now you're endangering our investment in those rare earth mineral deposits. So back off, essentially, right? It's kind of like, we're going to keep on going with the schoolyard analogy. It's kind of like, okay, if this is dark all of a sudden, imagine it's the Crips and Bloods, right? The Crips were blue, the Bloods were red. And you're like, well, I don't want to be, maybe you say, I don't like the Bloods, but I don't want to identify as a Crip. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wear, what's a color that's close to blue, but not blue? Teal. I'm going to wear teal, and I'm going to invest in a laundromat with the Crips. So I'm not, if things actually get to shooting, it's ambiguous whether I would stand with the Crips against the Bloods, but now the Bloods actually have to think about it because they recognize that, yeah, money is at play. And as I said in my reel that I posted yesterday, morality is a local language. Everyone has their own morality. I would hope that there's certain universal moral principles that we can all stand by, like slavery is wrong and killing people is wrong. But even those are up for negotiation in a lot of cultures, from a lot of perspectives. I mean, those are my beliefs. I think slavery and killing are always evil. You can maybe convince me that they're a necessary evil, but I think that often what we call a necessary evil is something that we just didn't solve before it got to that point. But that's a different, more moral philosophy tangent that we don't really need to go on today. But the point here is that morality is a local language. Everyone has different morality. Everyone has different cultures. Everyone has different contextual morality in different cases. That's why I gave you the pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian arguments, so that you could see there's a reasonable disagreement here. There's a reasonable disagreement. So what's a universal language? Power, money. It's an ugly truth of the world, but you don't need to speak the same language as someone if you know that you're both capable of violence. Right? Everyone can read the possibility of violence and work around that. You don't need to speak the same language as someone if you can exchange currency. Money talks, power talks. That's just the way of the world. So in this case, a lot of the people who are staunch pro-Ukraine diehards, I mean, I understand from a moral standpoint why they're saying this, but we have to be realistic about the power dynamics here, which is that Russia is just far stronger than Ukraine. And if the US didn't back Ukraine, this war would probably be over. And that's to say, that's not to denigrate the valor of the Ukrainian soldiers who have been fighting to defend their homeland against an invader. But this war would probably be over without American money and European money. I didn't even speak of it might actually be more money that the EU has committed at this point to the Ukrainian resistance effort against Russia. So we need to be practical. And here's where we get into the unfortunate, controversial territory, but we need to talk about it. At this point, Russia has already captured land. Just like they annexed Crimea, they've annexed parts of Ukraine, or formerly Ukraine. Ukraine is probably not going to get those back because Russia, from their perspective, they don't have to give it back and they don't think they should give it back. So why would they give it back? And if we take hardline moral stances, well, the way that wars are resolved are either through compromise, and in compromise, everyone's at least a little bit unhappy because no one gets everything that they want, or annihilation, i.e., one side being completely dominated and sometimes eradicated. I certainly don't want the latter, so we need to talk about the former. And again, I think from a pro-Ukrainian perspective, it totally makes sense why it would be frustrating that Putin just did this, that he just decided to invade whatever the reason was and would get to keep land after this conflict. And yet that's where I see this going, because power is a universal language. And if we don't respect that language and we try to instead only respect moral language, then the two sides are just going to talk past each other because they're not speaking the same language, and power is going to win in the end. So I think what the Trump administration is doing is a very delicate dance. I like that they're doing it this way rather than what the Biden administration was doing, because while there was all this moral standing on the high ground, people were dying on the ground. And as a human being, I would just like to see this thing resolved with the minimal loss of human life. Because all this stuff about like land disputes and territory disputes and ethnicity and race and ethnic Russia and what belonged to Russia in 1954 and what belongs to Ukraine now, and is Ukraine's government for their people or are they corrupt government? Like all of that is subjective. What's objective to me is that life is good, death is bad. And we only want to take life if it's absolutely necessary. And we should even then minimize the loss of life. So let's resolve this thing. And unfortunately, it might result in the Ukraine giving up territory that they had before 2022. So what happens from this point? Well, actually, little known fact, Putin announced that in May, he's going to have a ceasefire, and he says it's in memory of World War II. Ukraine is actually skeptical that Putin means what he says, and they would say that he said the same thing about Easter, and then that didn't actually happen. But I'm hoping that there are glimmers of light, glimmers of hope that we are nearing a peaceful resolution of this conflict, even if it's not a happy resolution of this conflict. I don't think we're ever going to get to a happy resolution of the conflict. I don't think geopolitical conflicts are almost ever happy, at least not in the short term. I mean, we can look at some historical disputes like France versus Germany. For a long time, France and Germany were beefing, and now they're part of NATO together, they're part of the EU together. So time does heal some wounds, and especially when nations start trading and start aligning economic incentives, you'd be surprised how quickly people can get over historical grievances. But yeah, in the short term, there's going to be some people who are really upset. It's totally understandable. Look, if this were the US and we had been invaded by a more powerful enemy like China, and then the conclusion of that had been, well, we give over New York and Virginia and Florida to China, but we get to keep the rest of the US, I would be like, damn, that sucks, and I really hate this morally. And I'm glad that we didn't have to get to the point of nukes to resolve this thing. And that's just the way of the world. So them's my thoughts on the US involvement in Ukraine, Russia. Again, the takeaway I want you to have is less about whether this is about Russia's in the right or Ukraine's in the right, but rather what is the right solution to get people to stop dying, and how can we make sure that we actually understand the various sides so that we can arrive at a compromise that doesn't make everyone happy but keeps everyone alive. So thanks for listening. Curious what you guys think. So I'm going to check the chat. If you guys are guys, gals, all of you, if you're a subscriber on X or Instagram or a YouTube member, I prioritize your questions. So I do these streams every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 1 p.m. as a thank you to people who are subscribers, who are making me spending all this time and energy making these videos and spending all this time commenting possible, because you're helping me pay my bills. I prioritize your questions. That said, sometimes on the live stream, I miss the questions because it's really hard for me to tell who's a subscriber and who's not. I don't have a function to distinguish that, unfortunately. StreamYard, please add that function if you're listening. And but if I do recognize you, because I do pay attention to who my subscribers are, I'd like to prioritize your questions in the chat. And if I do miss your questions, what I do is I post a thread. Not a thread after this on Instagram and on YouTube, where you could submit your questions. So even if I don't get to it live on stream today, I will get to it on the next stream, which is going to be Monday at 1 p.m. And also, announcement for my subscribers, I'm going to do a live Ask Me Anything. So it's going to be hosted on X, but I'm going to dual stream it on a Zoom call. So for those of you who want to interact more directly with me and actually like ask me questions live, I'm going to be hosting a call on Sunday at 5 p.m. Pacific time, just for my subscribers. So look forward to that, and I'll announce that on the various social platforms as well. So yeah, that's an extra bonus. You guys get to interact with me directly, and it's fun for me because, no offense, but when I just see text on a screen, I mean, I know that it's a human, but it hits different when I actually get to hear your voices and sometimes even see your faces. So looking forward to that Sunday at 5 p.m. Pacific. Now I'm going to avert my eyes from the camera where I've been looking at the whole time to establish human connection, and I'm going to look at the chat so that I can see what you guys are saying. Okay. Stefan says the only way out of this war comes from that framework. I agree. Look, ultimately, this can't be about who's right and wrong. Like, yes, we should have the moral discussion, but we got to have the practical discussion too. And the practical discussion is frankly more important than the moral discussion, because the practical discussion can be resolved and the moral conversation can't always. I think the moral conversation is so that we put in place practical frameworks so this kind of stuff doesn't happen again. But yeah, this was a complicated situation because look, from a Russian perspective, US has been violating sovereignty and then saying that Ukraine's sovereignty needs to be protected. So I get it. I don't think it justifies an invasion, but Russia's even wanted to join NATO at points. And I acknowledge that one could say that Putin, he just wants land and he wants money and he was just looking for a reason. I could see that argument too, but we certainly don't need to provide even plausible reasons by doing international meddling in foreign affairs that could make our distant neighbors upset, right? Like if Russia was constantly doing things in Mexico, we would take issue with it. So I would like the US to just take a more, frankly, America first and frankly more isolationist point of view on things. I think we've been prosecuting this globalist agenda for the last several decades. I don't think it's produced good results. I think it's really damaged the American brand. I think a lot of people don't trust America. I don't think many people consider America a moral authority anymore, especially after what happened from the Middle East campaign for like 20 years nearly. And yeah, I just think that we have so many big domestic issues. And frankly, we have so much energy that gets consumed by the Ukraine, Russia, and the Israel, Palestine stuff. And it's like, these things are important at a human level for sure. They're tangentially at best important from an America perspective. And we certainly have more important issues to deal with at home. And just like I'm not constantly worrying about what a neighbor in Sudan has going on. Like I care as a human. I wish them the best. But like my belief is that we got to take care of our own affairs before we worry about anyone. And in fact, maybe even once our own affairs are taken care of, we don't meddle in the affairs of foreign nations, because it's hard enough to manage a culture and a country and a government here without doing it in another country that we don't understand. And often we do things saying that we're promoting liberal democracy and spreading Western values and making things good. And you know what? Maybe some places are not compatible with Western values, and maybe that's okay. And maybe we need to stop moralizing to the whole world and believing that we always know what's right. So yeah, I would like us to just have a less interventionist disposition toward the rest of the world more generally, because even if you could convince me that this interventionism is necessary, I don't think we're particularly good at it. I just don't think we have a very good track record. So great comments, Stefan. Leaning in here. Osaka Joe. Osaka Joe says, aren't rare earths all over the place? My understanding is Chinese mining companies undercut others, so everyone buys from China only because of price. If China blocked, then other companies can make profit mining rare earths. I don't know. It sounds like you might know more about this than me. What I do know is that the U.S. is reliant on 70% of its imports for rare earth minerals on China. I don't know if that's just because of price or availability. I know that as an American taxpayer who is afraid of a pending conflict with China, I would like us to make sure as much of our supply line for crucial technologies like AI semiconductors and drones and all that other stuff is not reliant on China. So maybe you're right. Maybe this doesn't actually resolve the supply issue, but at least it's a vector that can be explored and is now opened. And again, I think this is less about the rare earth minerals, and it's more about us signaling to Russia that we are aligned with Ukraine and we want a peaceful resolution of this conflict. And if Russia continues to be aggressive, there is a chance, unknown how high that chance is, that the US will get more involved, because at this point it would be threatening US economic interests. So that's all I got on that. I'm not an expert on rare earth minerals, but that's my understanding of the issue. And great question. And it's interesting that I see someone with Osaka in his name start popping up just after I got back from Osaka, which I'm going to talk about in a second and share with you guys some of my Japan experience. So welcome, Osaka Joe. Let me just scroll through. A lot of comments from Facebook people today. What's up, Facebook people? I don't think I even have subscriptions enabled for Facebook. I should probably get on that. All right, see if there's any other comments. Again, if you're a subscriber and you feel like I'm missing your comment, I promise it's not because I want to. It's because I can't see that you're a subscriber. But go ahead and just comment and say you're a subscriber. Honor system here. If I think you're lying, I'll verify later, but honor system here so that you get my attention. Let's see. Sarah says, I don't want to see Russia take any part of Ukraine. I don't think Putin will stop there, but this is Europe's backyard, and Europe should be shouldering the responsibility of helping Ukraine, and Ukraine should pay back the money the U.S. has spent the same way that Ukraine is paying back Europe, even with the minerals deal, which the U.S. needs. I think that's a reasonable perspective. I don't want Russia taking any part of Ukraine either. As far as whether Putin will stop there, I think it's more likely than not, simply because of NATO. I think it's much different to invade a technically neutral state than it is to invade, some people have said Poland, which is literally part of NATO. And if he did that, that would trip Article 5 of NATO, and then the US would get involved. And I don't think Putin wants that smoke. But this is purely speculative territory. I think some people just believe that Putin just wants to take over the world. My belief is I don't believe that he does. And even if, to give the Steelman version, if you think that he's trying to restore the Soviet Union, which is, I think, a more reasonable concern, he literally can't do that without invading NATO allies. And I think he would be very loath to do that. I don't think that's something that Russia, keep in mind, Russia is in the global power balance. It's like US 1 or 1A, China 2 or 1B, and then Russia's a distant third. They do have the biggest nuclear stockpile in the world. That's fair, but it's a much smaller economy than ours. They do have a highly trained and versatile military, but it would definitely be a costly conflict for Russia. And I don't understand Russian culture or politics, so I can't say. And maybe there's like hard right elements in Russia who are pushing for the restoration of the Soviet Union. In fact, I'm confident that there are. But yeah, I'm just not convinced that this is just step one in the plan to certainly take over the world, if not restore the Soviet Union. And regardless, I just think that the U.S. shouldn't be giving Putin any plausible reasons. And ironically, if the U.S. had not been meddling in the affairs of Ukraine, then Putin would have much less of a plausible reason, and then a lot more support would actually be going to Ukraine, because it would be a much more clearly morally black and white situation. But I don't think it's as clearly a morally black and white situation as it would be otherwise if the US was not involved in, again, this failed approach to foreign policy and interventionism. Great comment, though. Makes me think. All right, we'll take maybe 1-2 more before we move on and start talking about Japan. Question: if we have an idea for a topic we would like to have your opinion on, what is the best way to ensure that you might receive our idea? Great question, Rita. Rita, I think you actually might be a subscriber. So if you are, thank you for your support. So I will post a thread on my subscriber only tab right after this so that you can see, and then just comment in that thread. Or actually what you can do, and now that I'm not using the teleprompter anymore, I can actually just go look right now. On the X stream, while it's live right now, you can comment on it just like any X post, and I will see that you're a subscriber, and I will answer your question at the end of this stream. So you can go ahead and post it right now on that thread, and that's also a good way to get my attention. So thanks for asking. Thank you, Megan. Appreciate you. Megan says she enjoys my thoughts. Appreciate that. Joy says I am an amazing voice of reason. Thank you. It's a pleasure to get to share my gifts in a useful way. Been looking for that for a long time. All right. I'm going to drink some water, and then we're going to talk about my experience in Japan, or a specific part of it. Okay. So, as many of you know, I just got back from Japan, and my name is Kaizen. Fun fact, Kaizen is my legal name, but is not my birth name. I changed it to Kaizen from Derek, and Derek is now my middle name after a spiritual awakening that I had in 2020, It involves ayahuasca and a healing journey and all this spiritual stuff. And Kaizen is a Japanese word that means continual improvement. I absolutely love Japanese culture. I love just how high of a standard for mastery and craft that the Japanese people have. I've been to Japan 3 times. This is my third time. And yeah, I feel very enriched there. Like every time I go there, I feel inspired, and it shows me specifically what we can accomplish here in the West, especially in their cities, because their cities are so safe, they're clean, they're organized. There's a culture of decorum there. Even little things like people dress really well, and not in like a performative way, but more like out of self-respect. It feels like you go places, people are so helpful to you. The food quality is insane. Not even just like the quality of the cuisine, but literally the supply chain there. They just have higher quality food. You feel it when you have something, with gluten or a lot or sugar. You don't feel as bloated and nasty and gross as you do when you eat American food. There's just a very high standard that the Japanese hold themselves to. And yes, I know they have their own problems with declining birth rates, just like we have with our domestic population here and so on. But I just love Japan, and I have since I was a kid. I've grew up watching anime and playing Japanese video games, and yeah, a part of me feels like I was Japanese in a past life, if that's a thing. So I went this year because I just wanted to go for fun. I'd been working really hard for the last 8 months, and especially the last 6 weeks prior to that. I made a commitment that I'm going to go full time in being an influencer, and I put out a video every single day for 6 weeks, sometimes more than one video a day. And I was burnt out by the end of it. Like I was really tired. Like I've never been this burnt out. Like literally for the first week in Japan, it's like I had a low grade headache the whole time. So yeah, I'm not going to do that again. But I proved to myself that I could do it. My audience has grown a lot. I'm glad that I got to just see how hard I can work on this thing. And I decided, yeah, I'm going to make this my full-time thing. And for context, before starting to speak out about current events and politics and cultural issues, I was not a political person at all. I was a life coach, and I still am actually. And I coach people on confidence and finding courage and helping people be more clear on what they want and just aligning their goals with their actions. And I still do that, by the way, in case you're interested in me supporting you and through this part of your life's journey. So there's actually a link in my bio if you're interested in me mentoring you. But yeah, I'm currently in a transition from full-time life coach to full-time influencer. I'm basically part-time with each right now. And it's been a lot of work. So I went to Japan to be spiritually restored, turn off the social media, and ignore that for a while. And we went to Tokyo, Kiso Valley, and Osaka. Tokyo, most people know Tokyo. It's the most famous city in Japan. I guess that and Kyoto, which is the capital of Japan. And I'd been there several times. Kiso Valley is like a more traditional, old Japanese town. Think like old Japanese buildings, really beautiful, really tranquil. That we went for, I think it was 3 days, 4 days, 3 nights. And that was just beautiful restoration, sauna, cold plunge, nothing to do all day. Awesome. And then we get to Osaka. Now, one of my dreams is at some point I want to spend a year of my life living somewhere. And if I lived anywhere, it would probably be Osaka after I visited it. Osaka is more like the LA equivalent or Japan's LA equivalent. If New York is Tokyo, then LA is Osaka. And people are, I think, a little bit more creative and a little bit more open, because in Tokyo, people are very reserved. It can feel like it's very hard to penetrate Japanese culture in Tokyo. But Osaka, just my vibe. I actually got this jacket in Osaka. And one night while we were out in Osaka, we were just roaming the streets, me and my friends. It was a group of 7 of us, a pretty big group. We're like drinking, having fun, just having childlike adventures. And at the time, I hope this wasn't offensive. I thought it was funny. I was pretending that I didn't know how to speak English, and I was speaking with like a Japanese accent. So it was really funny. So I meet these 2 girls, and they're around age 22, 23, and they're foreigners, or foreigners relative to Japan. One of the girls is from a place in the US, I'm not going to disclose, and the other girl was from a place in Canada. And they are asking us for directions, and I say, hey, just come with us. We're having a good time. We're more fun than whatever you're going to do anyway. So just come join us. So we're having fun and just goofing around for maybe an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours or so. Then at some point we start going into this nightclub or some sort of establishment just to go check it out. And one of the girls says, Trump and JD Vance need to die. And I'm like, did I just hear that? A, out of any human being's mouth in person, and B, in the middle of Japan. And then she says it again. And I don't know if it was after the second time or she said it a third time, but me being me, I was like, all right, I there's just no way I'm gonna let a comment like that slide. I know we're all just trying to have a good time, but like literally wishing death on another human in the middle of conversation, I'm not willing to just like let that slide in a polite conversation, especially if not with someone who I'm going to be spending some of my limited time in Osaka with. So we got to address this right now. So I confronted her about it first, kind of like playfully, and like made jokes about feminism, and you know, she made jokes about Democrat men, Republican men, and then all of a sudden, I frankly don't remember how it even got to this point, but it escalated pretty quickly to a conversation about abortion. So imagine we're like out on the streets of Osaka, we just had a few beers. This woman starts talking about Trump and JD Vance needing to die, and then all of a sudden we get into this discussion about abortion. And I wasn't particularly drunk. I'm actually proud of how I handled this part of the conversation because I recognize that they were emotionally agitated, as many young women are when the topic of abortion comes up. And it was a very classic example of political discourse gone wrong, because so it's clear my position on abortion is I think we need to be pro choosing life. I think every single abortion is a tragedy. I think we should avoid it as much as possible. I think we're having way too much abortion. And I also don't think it's tenable to just take women's ability to have an abortion away. I think it would completely erode all trust between men and women in the United States and cause a complete unraveling of the social fabric that's already unraveling. So I believe that women should have the right to choose that. And I believe that women are choosing to have abortions way too often. And I'm not saying that as a moral judgment, I'm saying it's a shared problem between the sexes. There's a piece of men like not providing that masculine leadership and protectorship and providership and staying around when a woman gets pregnant and helping a woman feel safe to bring a child into the world. And I think that many women are making themselves too available for casual sex and unprotected sex, and having pregnancies that they're not planned for, that they're not ready for. And I think a lot of this comes down to the collapse of the nuclear family and traditional gender roles. So there's a whole complicated thing. Essentially, I'm pro choosing life. I think women should have the right to choose, and I would like them to choose life as much as possible. And it's not happening enough. We have over 1 million abortions a year in the US alone. That's insane. Only around 1 to 5% of abortions are medically necessary. That means the other 99 to 95% of abortions are simply a decision by the woman. And I totally understand why a woman would make that decision if she feels unsupported by the world, or unsupported by the man who got her pregnant, or unready to have the child at that point in her life. Like, I can see the perspective. And still, I consider every single abortion a tragedy, and it's just happening too often. And I think we're glossing over it by saying things like, oh, it's just a clump of cells, or it's just tissue. It's not a life. It's not sentient. It's not conscious. I mean, no one talks about a miscarriage that way, and an abortion is an intentional miscarriage. Now, I just spent 3 minutes giving you my whole part of my thesis on abortion, right? Imagine people are having some drinks and we're on the streets of Osaka, and the spontaneous conversation comes up and there was no container setting or preamble. We're just all of a sudden in a discussion. So obviously it wasn't set up in an ideal way. But part of the problem was they were just kind of shouting me down. Like, they were not in a space to listen to me. I feel like I was doing a good job of listening to them. They were not listening to me. And the reason I'm mentioning this is not because this is really about abortion, but just a really troubling trend that I've seen among young, liberal, college educated women in particular, where I just see, I see, obviously, we've seen the Tesla vandalism, and the Tesla vandalism, what's niche is the number of people doing it. What's not niche is the worldview that's supportive of it. You know, there was this poll that showed that the majority of liberals say that an assassination of Trump is at least partially acceptable. And this was done by Rutgers in collaboration with some sort of think tank. I don't know how the study was done, how rigorous the study was done, but in my personal experience, as someone who's lived in LA for the last 11 years, this is not as fringe of a view as one might think. In the last month and a half, this is what I've had happen. I had someone storm onto my property to heatedly lecture me without permission to enter, just like entered through my garage door to lecture me because they heard me talking about something because I was recording a video outside that they disagreed with and started lecturing me. I don't know what Trump has told you or Fox News has told you, but in this country we have free speech protections. And it was about the deportations of these pro-Palestine activists. It was, as is hopefully you come to expect from me, a very nuanced take on things. He only heard like maybe 15 seconds of the video and then ambushed my property to lecture me. And he clearly was attached to a more liberal worldview. So it's like, regardless of your views on the particular subject matter that we're talking about, why would you believe it's okay to trespass on private property to your neighbor, like he actually knows me, and I consider it trespassing because of the hostility. He wasn't knocking on the door to check in and catch up or like tell me about a package left on my doorstep. No, he was entering forcefully to forcefully correct what he believed was an incorrect opinion. I also experienced a neighbor, again, someone else I know, casually mentioned that they hope that Trump chokes on a hamburger. Right? This is a woman, an older woman, but liberal woman. And then I go to Osaka and I hear young 22 and 23-year-old women, one of them an American, another one of them Canadian, saying, and in fairness, the Canadian didn't say this, the American said this, Trump and JD Vance need to die. And then on top of that, in the course of this abortion discussion, not only did they not even hear me, and again, my position is not that they shouldn't have the right to have an abortion. I just think that men and women need to get together and make sure that the conditions are such that we don't have so many people choosing abortion. So I would hope that that's something we can get on the same page about. But no, they kept on, it was honestly just very clear that they weren't listening. They just viewed me as a toxic male who's telling them what rights that they should or should not have, not able to hear me. And then this is where it gets even more insane. I was gentle and compassionate and trying to like talk them down. And then the group kind of separates. One of the girls is more heated. She goes off. And then one of the other girls tells me, well, actually, when she was 8, her mom told her that she considered having an abortion of her. So pause on this for a second. One of these young women tells me that she was almost aborted. And then she tells me, oh, well, I would have understood if my mom did it. And I tell her very simply, look, I'm not willing to believe that there's any world that would have been better because you're not in it because your mom got an abortion. Period. And we ended up in this very strange position where she is trying to argue for her not being alive because her mom, I don't know what the reason her mom actually had for considering an abortion was. I'm glad that she didn't follow through on an abortion. But I mean, look, we talked about morals being and morality being a local language, and everyone has their own morality. And I would hope that people wouldn't argue for something that ends in their own non-existence. Like, to me, that is any moral logic that argues for your own extinction. I mean, I hesitate to use this word. Let's at least say it is not self-interested. It's just not self-interested. Like I don't understand that. I don't understand a young woman arguing that if her mom had gotten an abortion, she would be okay with it. I mean, of course, ignoring the existential impossibility of her being around to be okay with it because she'd be dead. She wouldn't be here unless, I mean, maybe her soul would look down and be like, yeah, you know what, mom, I'm glad you got the abortion. Yeah, I'm very concerned about some of the ideas that young women are not just supporting, but getting actively emotionally invested and agitated over. To the point where we can't even have a discussion about the real issue, which is not what abortion law should be, which if the real issue is how do we have less abortion? And how do we have young women not saying things like Trump and JD Vance need to die? It's like, who has died in the last 100 days of Trump's presidency? No one. No one has died as a result of his actions. So why are we moving to extremes in casual conversation, like wishing death on another human being? And yeah, any person can be dehumanized, including the most powerful person on the planet. That's still a human too. And if the way that we resolve our disagreements is with violence, then we don't have any need for civil society anymore, and we are returned to a state of nature. And a state of nature is not a state that any of us wants to be in. Trust me. No one wants to be in a world where we resolve things through violence. And if you sow violence, you reap violence. If you act violently, people will react violently. That's why we have civil society in the first place. Because at some point, human A got together with human B and said, you know what? This whole mutually assured destruction, I poke you with a stick in the eye and you poke me in the chest, and we see who survives, and that's how we resolve our disagreements, doesn't work very well. It certainly does not scale to 9 billion people. One of the great innovations of humanity is that we managed to create this thing called civil society, where we resolve things through civil means rather than combat. That needs to be protected at all costs because the cost is human life otherwise. So no, it's not okay to me ever to be wishing death as a political solution. Period. Not even in casual conversation. And to be clear, this is not like a joke. Right? Like I could even see with the woman who said, "I hope Trump chokes on a hamburger." It was kind of just like a off-color joke, and maybe in some circles it's funny. Okay, this was not a joke. This was someone repeatedly saying, "Trump and JD Vance need to die." And look, I get that there's people, and I think especially liberal women, who feel very anxious about the direction of the country, feel very concerned. They're concerned about minority rights. They're concerned about their own rights and reproductive rights and all these other things. And still, if the terminus of the logic is, hey, we need to be assassinating democratically elected leaders, then there's something wrong with the logic. If the terminus of your logic is, I wish that my forebears had aborted me, there is something wrong with the logic. And now when we talk about gender roles and the relationship between men and women and masculine and feminine, look, it's simply a fact that women, and all love to women, like actually, funnily enough, I was looking at my demographics and I have an unusually high percentage of women following me apparently in the political space, which I'm deeply appreciative of. And I like to think that's because I really try my best to be emotionally intelligent and engage in these discussions with care. And men and women are equals, but we're not equivalent. We have different things that we're good at. Just like I would be more likely to trust a woman to be the babysitter for my child, I'll be more trusting of a man to make decisions in a military conflict. Because I think men and women are just tend to be better at different things. I think that's okay, and that's actually desirable. I think it's good that men and women have different roles. The ideal is that men and women are on unions so that we complement each other and do things that us as individuals can't do. And I think one of the things that's been going on with this epidemic of loneliness and hookup culture and just perpetual singledom, of which I'm a part, by the way. Like, I'm not in a relationship. I would very much like to be, and that's a stage in my life that I'm looking for right now. One of the consequences of this is I think women are more susceptible to irrational, more emotionally driven, destructive logic. And this bears out in the data. Liberal women tend to be unhappier than their conservative counterparts and men. That's just the data. Now, we can get into all sorts of discussions on why. I've heard arguments like, oh, well, it's because liberal women care more about other people in oppressed groups. I don't really think that's it. The conservative women very much care about other people too. I think it's honestly just a lot of parts of the extreme liberal worldview produce unhappiness. And I got to see it on the streets of Osaka that night, where this woman was sadly arguing to me strangely that if she had not been alive, that would have been at least a morally equal outcome to the outcome that we're experiencing right now, which is that she's getting to experience life on vacation in a foreign country with a friend that she had just met there. that's amazing. I think it's awesome that she's getting to have that experience. And no, I'm not going to be convinced that her being aborted would in any world have been better than the world that we're in, which is the one where she's alive. And yeah, I think men's responsibility is to help protect women from some of these like really dangerous ideas and help women calm down when they're feeling anxious and unsafe and their minds are just running unruly. But we don't have that now. It's like, yeah, I think men are scared of women and women hate men, and no one is benefiting from this. And in the battle of the sexes, everyone loses. And we really need to get a handle on this. And maybe at some point I'll propose, I mean, I think the part of the solution is just identifying the problem and recognizing it's a shared responsibility. This is not about women bad. This is not some like red pill, screw women, go get jacked and buy a bunch of Lamborghinis or whatever. Like that's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is there's a problem. And I understand the male part of it. I think we've talked a lot about the culture has been dominated by the discussions of toxic masculinity, which is a thing for sure, and the abuses that men have put women through, and the ways in which women were in men's thrall and could be abused and not have any kind of recourse because they are financially dependent. All of those things were issues for sure. And now I think we're swinging the pendulum in the other direction, and I don't think anyone's happier because of it. I don't think anyone's happier having fewer kids. I don't think anyone's happier having fewer relationships. I don't think anyone's happier having more divorces. I don't think anyone's happier going through more divorce settlements where people are getting to ugly discussions about who gets how much money and what property and all this other stuff. I don't think anyone's benefiting from it. And I think if you disagree with me subjectively, well, objectively, what's happening across the first world, in Japan included, is the birth rate is declining. And I think any sort of worldview that terminus is lower birth rates and birth rates that are below replacement rates, which is literally the human population shrinking, that's as close to objective proof that the worldview is dysfunctional as we can get. Like, I mean, everything else about like family values and all this other stuff, we can kind of explain away and we can engage in sort of moral relativism. But if humanity, or at least a culture, is literally going extinct because of its own views, it's a sign that the views are probably not very functional. So yeah, I just wanted to get that off my chest because what happened really bothered me. I hope both of these young women, and I told them at the end of the discussion, like, I hope that they go on to have happy, successful, productive lives and like no hard feelings, genuinely. No hard feelings. And I found it really worrying. Like I was like, damn, like we're really at that point where people just like, it's one thing when you read about this on the internet. It's another thing when you go to a foreign country and you meet a foreigner and this comes up in the course of casual conversation 2 hours later. So it bothered me. And I think the sooner we recognize this as a shared problem, the sooner we recognize the differences between the sexes and the relative strengths and weaknesses and how we're two halves of a complete whole, the better. We can actually get to a situation where everyone is happier and healthier, and kids are being raised in families, and little boys don't think that they need to be little girls, and little girls don't think that they need to be little boys, and women don't think that having a baby is the end of their life, and men don't shirk the responsibility of bringing a human into the world. If we can resolve all that, I think it's dope, because look, we're all going to die one day, and an awareness of that hopefully helps us all become present to the fact that we have one goal in mind, which is to have a good life. So let's figure out how to have a good life rather than dividing the world between good and bad people. That's it. And I promise that was not all of what happened in Japan. I had a fucking amazing, oh, sorry. I like to not curse on these things, but sometimes I just let it out. I had an amazing time in Japan. It was awesome. I got to spend time with some of my best friends. It was a core memory. Gonna remember that experience more generally. This thing did not cast a dark pallor over my experience. I had a great time. And in fact, I actually like having these experiences because it's real life. And it's one thing to be on camera talking to you guys about stuff going on X. It's also really important to get out in the real world and interact with people and see where people's heads are at. And yeah, what I saw about where these young women's heads were at was troubling. So I wanted to share it with you. All right. We're almost at 2:30 Pacific time. So I'm going to leave soon. Before I do, let me just check out the chat, see what you guys are saying about my story. And then we're leaving. And yes, that is a message for the world. Gain knowledge, seek wisdom. Great name. All right. All right. All right. Oh, wow. Thank you, Sarah. That's a very kind thing to say. So I'm the best commentator on current events. Yeah. Tell them. Tell them. And you know what's funny? Look, I'm pretty smart and I have a gift for words, but I honestly think there's people who are comparably intelligent and comparably eloquent. I don't think that's like the thing that really helps me stand out. I think the thing that helps me stand out is that I'm just genuinely committed to trying to not add to the hostility. Like I have my moments, I have my things, my moments, especially on X where it's just text and it's hard to bring the emotional nuance that you're getting to hopefully experience right now. I have my moments, but like I'm genuinely trying to not be hostile because I think a lot of the time, the majority of the time, the hostility that we see in the political discourse is just unnecessary. It's way too much and it's just ineffective, right? It's not even about being nice. It's like literally, look, we got to collaborate with other humans on this 80 years that we each get to spend on this planet. The best way to get other people to do what is in your shared interests is to be friendly and for people to feel like you care about them and that you empathize and that even if you disagree, you at least are listening and understand. I'm sure all of us have had experiences before where we felt like someone wasn't even listening and we just gave up. We're like, you know what, screw this person. Like I'm done. And either you lose a friend, you don't even resolve the disagreement, you just kind of drift apart over time, or things even blow up. It gets verbally hostile or physically hostile. And I think that's what a lot of what we're seeing in the world. And I want to stand for something genuinely different. And you know, I actually was going to make a little reel about it, but let's just talk about it now since we're flowing. So I just signed my first sponsor, which I'm very excited about, and it's a big step for me. I'm not going to make this about the sponsor because they'll get what they're paying for. They're not paying for this, but it's Ground News. If you guys have heard of them, they're a new media app that basically takes the aggregate of different stories about a particular topic, and rather than telling you that, oh, here's the unbiased version of the truth, because I don't believe anyone has the unbiased truth, they show you the different outlets and it shows you how biased they are. So it'll show like New York Times is owned by these people, tends to be more left leaning. Fox News, owned by these people, tends to be more conservative leaning. So it's actually like the dream sponsor for me. And we haven't done any activations yet, but for those of you on X and Facebook, they're just doing Instagram advertisements with me. So the Instagram people will see it and hopefully the deal will expand. But it's a big moment for me. And there's kind of mixed emotions because although I'm excited to be getting paid for my work, because I haven't been getting paid outside of like, revenue share off of views for on X and Facebook and Instagram, which is like not that much, certainly not enough to make a living. So this is a move toward actually making this sustainable for myself. The downside is there's more responsibility. And when financial incentives get in play, it can be easy to hide your views or change your views, or even for people to perceive that your views have changed, even if your views haven't changed. So, I absolutely was going to do it because this is the only way that I get to keep doing this. I'm not independently wealthy. But also I was like, damn, it's like a lot of responsibility. And I want to figure out how to do this in a way that still feels aligned and authentic and transparent. And yeah, my encouragement to those of you who have been watching me consistently and continue to watch me consistently is, yeah, just always hold me accountable to being authentic. I like to think that the reason why I've been resonating with people is that I don't talk like a pundit. I'm not trying to slam dunk people all the time. I try to consider the other side. And let me tell you, there's so many times where I was like, I know exactly what I could say to go viral right now. I know exactly what I could say. I know exactly what I could say to get a sponsorship that would pay me a lot more money. I know exactly what to say to get me a lot more followers. Yes, I recognize that I'm the black guy with dreads who is aligned with MAGA, at least for now, and that's unusual, and that itself gets attention. I could totally lean into that. And I choose not to, not because I'm like some good person, but because I just wouldn't sleep well at night. It wouldn't feel good for me, and it wouldn't be fun, and I can go do other things for a job. And I want to do this because it's not just something that I'm good at, but something that really matters to me. So yeah, I really appreciate comments like yours, Sarah. I don't want to let people down. I take my influence seriously. This is not just about numbers on my follower count, it's cool to get recognized in public, and that started happening. It's cool to get paid, and when I get paid, I want to make millions, and I want to reach millions, and I want to get, I don't know, like maybe I do run for office someday. Who knows? But I really want to do it without losing myself. And I just observe a lot of people who get into this space become caricatures of themselves. Like they have a big moment, they get known for something, and then they just keep on doing the same thing, and they become predictable. And there's just sort of like a slow drift from the authentic person that they used to be. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that for sponsors. And you take this for what you will, but I'm never going to say something that I don't believe because I'm getting paid for it. And I will talk about things that I was less likely to talk about because a sponsor is covering it, right? So like, for instance, like I'm probably more likely to talk about the hot button issues because I want to talk about things that people are going to pay attention to. But my commitment is to say what I authentically believe. And that's why I'm not just taking on any sponsor. I'm taking on sponsors who, first of all, just if there's a minimal conflict of interest, like with Ground News, it's great because they are nonpartisan. Like their literal job is to show you both sides. And yeah, I want people who are backing me because of me, not just because I have a bunch of followers who are paying attention to me. So yeah, you people, I say that in the nicest possible, like kindest possible way. Like you people, like you watching right now, you're making this possible for me. What I'm doing right now, it feels so aligned. Like I've never felt more purposeful. I could say that I'm living my dream, but I didn't like dream of doing what I'm doing now. I guess I'm living some like Gen Z person's dream because apparently the Gen Z dream is to be an influencer, and I'm that, and I want to do influence in a different way. So yeah, if you're watching right now, thank you for watching. Really appreciate each and every single one of you for spending your time, for trusting me with your mind and your opinions and all of that. And yeah, I take it seriously. I will not let you down, and let's keep on doing it. I'm built weird. I'm built in a way that I actually like these really sensitive discussions. I'm the kind of person who likes getting into a conversation about Trump and JD Vance and civil society and abortion on the streets of Osaka during my vacation. So yeah, I spend a lot of time and energy on this, and I spend it because I love it. I just love it. And I recognize that not everyone loves it. So I think, I'm fulfilling my purpose, and hopefully that supports you. And then you're fulfilling your purpose in your neck of the world. And in some way, I'm sure that's supporting me and the services and goods that I rely on. And together, like we all make a life that all of us want to live. So I think that's it. I've been very loquacious today, but it feels good. I'm gonna check the chat one last time before I leave. What do I read for news? Well, Ground News is actually a news app that I use to see what the stories are and how they're being reported on both sides. And once I don't know how I'm going to do this because I see, Marnie, you're commenting from X. Yeah, I'm going to be advertising on Instagram, but I have like a discount link that they're going to give me that I can give to my followers. So if you're interested, you'll hear about that somehow. The best way to hear about it is on Instagram. The reason I'm being kind of dodgy is like I'm not even sure if they want me to promote on X. I got to figure that out. But yeah, I also use Ground News. But I spend a lot of time on X, and I spend a lot of time just thinking about stuff and talking to AI and like asking it questions, telling it to give me the best arguments for and against, asking it to point out any blind spots in my arguments. For this whole Ukraine-Russia discussion that I just had, I used ChatGPT to help me construct the timeline of events and then the best pro-Russia, best pro-Ukraine argument. So AI is a fantastic tool for aggregating the news as well. So Ground News, X, and AI. See more questions. Osaka Joe giving people the real talk. Osaka Joe means castle. Oh, cool. Oh, that's cool. We can learn a lot as Americans from Japanese culture, Frank says. I agree. Lori says she agrees with me on abortion. Yes, it is pretty ironic. It's yeah, it's ironic. Yeah, it's like you're arguing for abortion and while celebrating the idea of a live human dying. Guys, what are we doing? Death is. I think we've become desensitized to death. I think social media and the news, it just makes it think like death is not a big deal. It's like death is always a big deal. Let's see any other questions from. So I see some remaining questions, but since we're already way over time and my laptop, frankly, is about to run out of power, I'm just going to prioritize subscriber questions for now before I go. Frank says, congrats on the sponsorship. Thank you. Patrick talking about my Piers Morgan appearance. Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate that. Oh, I actually, I have some really cool events coming up. I don't know if I can talk about them yet, but I have a really big podcast appearance coming up in the next 2 weeks, as well as a really big debate coming up in the next 2 weeks. So you guys will hear about it. Okay, now just check on my phone, see if any questions from subscribers, and then we're out. I guess I should start expecting that every time I do these streams, it's going to be long. Like it's going to be an hour and a half because I get on here and then I'm like, actually, I'm really enjoying this. Let's keep on going. So maybe I should just advertise this as going on for an hour. Da, 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 da. Okay, I think we're good. All right. Thanks, everyone. This is fun. It's good to be back. Until next time, be kind to each other. Don't spend too much time on social media. It'll drive you crazy. Remember, nothing is more important than the people in your lives, not what's going on overseas, not what's going on in the news, but the actual human relationships that you have, because we all have a limited number of seconds and minutes and hours and interactions until we die. So treat everyone like it's special, because it is. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. Love you. Goodbye.